If you joined HumanitZ after the 1.04 update and felt that something was different, it wasn't your imagination. This patch didn't just come to fix bugs or adjust minor numbers. It silently changed the flow of the game, the way you survive, and honestly, the overall feel of playing. And most people didn't even notice. I dove deep into this update, tested quite a bit, and found 10 changes that are truly altering how you need to play now. Some seem small on paper, but in practice, they make a huge difference. Let's check them out. If you've played on official servers, you've likely encountered one of those players who spends hours building a base, floating in the air, literally in the middle of nowhere, with no support, no logic, and completely inaccessible to anyone trying to attack. It's the kind of thing that completely breaks game immersion and makes you wonder if you're playing a zombie, survival, or an impossible architecture simulator. Well, Yodub Studios has finally said enough is enough, and Update 1.04 brought a very direct measure for this. Here's the situation. While the team was developing a full structural support system, which will force every piece of your base to have real physical support, one of the developers discovered loopholes in the system just days before the patch launch. They didn't have time to fix it without delaying the update another week, so they opted for a more draconian and honest solution. Any player who builds a skybase or absurd bridges covering the entire map on official servers will simply be banned. No infinite warnings, no automatic second chances, it's a direct ban. And look, it's a brave decision that I respect. They could have hidden the problem, released the patch with the loophole, and pretended everything was fine, but they chose to be transparent, explained exactly what happened, and made it clear that the definitive solution comes in the next update. This says a lot about how Yodub has been handling game development. With very direct communication with the community, no beating around the bush, what remains is a high expectation for this upcoming structural support system. When it's actually implemented, every column, every wall, and every floor of your base will need to make physical sense in the game world. This will completely change how people think and build their bases, separating creative builders from those who just wanted an unfair advantage. For those who play honestly, this change is nothing but good news. If you've ever opened HumanitZ and stared at those horrible stutters while the map loaded, that feeling that the game is choking every time you enter a new area, know that update 1.04 brought one of the most important changes a 1.0 game can have. It's not new content, not a new weapon, not a biome. It's a background technical change that directly affects how the game handles your graphics card memory. The team migrated the file management system from hard references to soft references. In simple terms, before the game loaded an absurd amount of assets into the VRAM all at once, whether you needed them or not. Now, with soft references, the game loads things on demand more intelligently without pushing a pile of unnecessary data into the GPU memory at the same time. The direct result of this is lower VRAM usage and a significant reduction in microstutters that happened especially while exploring the map. And this matters immensely because stutters are one of the problems that most drive players away from many games. You can overlook a visual bug, you can overlook inconsistent balancing, but when the game freezes while you're being chased by a zombie horde, patience runs out fast. So this change, even being invisible in menus and never appearing on a list of flashy features, is exactly the kind of technical foundation a multiplayer survival game needs to grow solidly. What catches my attention here is that Yodub chose to prioritize this heavy lifting in a major update instead of just piling new content on top of an unstable base. This shows a maturity in development that not every indie studio demonstrates. Games that ignore this technical side accumulate debt until the point where fixing it becomes impossible. Those who have played HumanitZ for a long time know the game has advanced quite a bit, and with this change to the file manager, the technical foundation is more solid for everything ahead. Item duplication is one of those problems that seems harmless at first glance, but silently destroys any sense of progression and economy within a survival game. And in HumanitZ, this problem was quite present. Update 1.04 came with direct fixes for several duplication methods players were using, some by accident, others very intentionally. And two of them stood out as the most absurd. The first was a bug involving food. If you consumed exactly 10% of a food item while in the vicinity of another player, the item would duplicate. It seems too specific to be discovered by accident, and it probably wasn't. This type of exploit passes from hand to hand in the community until it reaches a point where half the server is farming infinite food while the other half doesn't even know it exists. The second involved the deconstruction system in containers, where you could recover materials in ways the game clearly didn't intend to allow. The problem with duplication in multiplayer survival games goes beyond simple imbalance. When someone has infinite resources, all the tension that makes the genre work disappears. Scarcity is the heart of survival. It's what makes you think twice before using that last med kit, what makes every loot decision have weight. When that goes down the drain because of an exploit, the game loses its best quality, even if the graphics and content remain the same. HumanitZ didn't detail all the methods they fixed in this update, which is quite smart. Publishing a full list of how to duplicate items, even if it's to say it's fixed, only serves as a manual for those who didn't know yet. What matters is that several vectors were closed at once, and the game becomes more honest for those who want to play the way it was designed. There's a type of bug that is small on paper, but in practice makes you lose valuable minutes trying to understand if you're doing something wrong or if the game simply isn't working. The issue of dirty water in barrels, composters, and crops was exactly that. You'd take your bottles of dirty water, try to use them on containers that should accept them, and nothing would happen. It felt like your mistake, but it wasn't. The water system in HumanitZ has a very interesting survival logic where dirty water can be used to water crops and feed composters without having to go through the purification process you reserve for drinking water. It makes total sense within a realistic survival context. The problem was that this system simply wasn't working as it should. The barrels and farming structures rejected the dirty water bottles without any clear explanation, which broke an entire cycle of farming and base sustainability. And this directly affects those who invest in the more peaceful and strategic side of the game. The player who spends hours setting up a self-sufficient base with organized crops and working composting, try to create an ecosystem that sustains itself without relying solely on external loot. When a piece of the system fails due to a bug, the frustration is proportional to how much you invested in that structure. It's not the kind of thing that goes into game highlights, but for those who play like this, it's essential. With the fix in 1.04, this cycle finally closes the way it should have from the start. Dirty water goes where it makes sense to go, the crops get what they need, and the player can focus on making in-game decisions instead of fighting against broken system behaviors. With this increased render distance for player-made constructions, combat near bases becomes much more legible. You can see the space beforehand, better understand where you're entering, and more clearly identify the surrounding danger. To me, this makes confrontations feel less cheap and more based on reading, positioning, and decision-making, which is exactly what I expect for other PvP that wants to be tense without being unfair. This also helps a lot in defending your own base. Because before there was that strange feeling of being in a built, theoretically protected place, yet still being vulnerable because of how the scenery loaded. In online games, this type of inconsistency kills player confidence. If the structure doesn't appear at the right time, the problem stops being skill and becomes pure visual lottery. And nobody likes losing that way. What I like most about this change is that it doesn't try to reinvent the game. It simply fixes a wrong feeling that was in PvP. It's the type of technical adjustment that doesn't make trailer noise, but immediately improves the experience for those who play seriously. In my view, this increase in base rendering makes HumanitZ more honest, because now you tend to die due to a mistake you made, rather than because the game showed the threat too late. Barbed wire on a base wall is one of those additions. This should be simple. You place it, the enemy touches it, they take damage. Simple as that. But before update 1.04, this logic wasn't working right in Humanity. Walls upgraded with barbed wire simply didn't cause damage to zombies or players, turning what should have been a real layer of defense into an expensive and useless decoration. And man, building an entire base relying on that protection, only to find out it did nothing, is the kind of thing that makes any player lose their cool. What makes this fix important is that barbed wire isn't just an aesthetic item, it's part of a passive defense strategy that many players use to create layers of difficulty around the base. The idea is simple and efficient. While an enemy is taking slow damage from the structure, you have time to react, position yourself, and make a decision. When this system fails, all that construction logic falls apart, and the player who invested in it simply threw resources away. Functioning correctly against zombies and players at the same time is also a detail that matters. On PvPvE servers, you need the same structure to be relevant in both situations. It's no use if it stops a zombie but completely ignores a player invading your base. With the fix in 1.04, barbed wire finally fulfills the role it should have had since it was implemented, being a real threat regardless of who is on the other side of the wall. This is another one of those fixes that doesn't feature prominently in any trailer, but concretely changes how people build and defend their bases. When a system works as promised, the player can plan with more confidence, test new strategies, and trust that the game will respond as expected. And in a survival game where every resource spent on construction represents real time and risk, knowing that barbed wire now does what it says it does is a small but very welcome victory. Imagine setting up a campfire, putting your food to cook, stepping out to check the base perimeter for a few seconds, coming back, and simply finding nothing there. No explanation, no error message. The items simply vanished while you weren't looking. This was a reality in HumanitZ before update 1.04, and it was exactly the kind of bug that makes you question if it's worth investing time in the game. Because the feeling of losing progress due to a technical failure is completely different from losing due to a wrong decision. The problem was linked to render distance, the same rendering distance that affects other game systems. When you moved far enough away for the campfire to go out of rendering range and then returned, the game simply couldn't reconcile the state of the items being processed in it, and they disappeared. It's a bug that seems simple to describe, but has roots in a much deeper system of how the game tracks objects in the world as they enter and exit the rendering field. This type of failure especially affects those who play more methodically and patiently, the player who spends real time managing resources, organizing food, and thinking about sustainability. Losing an entire cook because you took a short walk around the base isn't just frustrating, it's demotivating in a way that goes beyond simple inconvenience. You start avoiding the campfire, changing your behavior because of a bug, and that is exactly the sign that something needs to be fixed. With the fix in 1.04, items in the campfire persist correctly even when you move away and return from the render distance. It sounds simple, and it is simple from the player's perspective, which is exactly how it should be. The campfire now behaves as a reliable object within the game world, and you can cook without needing to be glued to it for fear of losing everything. Famine and drought are skills that exist to add an extra layer of challenge in HumanitZ, increasing the difficulty of managing hunger and thirst for your character. It's the kind of choice a player makes consciously when they want a tougher, truer survival experience. The problem is that before update 104, these skills were not working as they should. Instead of creating a calculated and fair challenge, they were simply draining your food and hydration values in completely wrong and unpredictable ways. When a skill doesn't work as described, it stops being a strategic choice and becomes a trap. You select famine thinking you'll have a more intense and controlled experience, but what happened in practice was inconsistent behavior that made it impossible to plan anything around it. You couldn't tell if you were losing food at the expected pace of the skill or because of a bug. And this uncertainty is terrible for any progression, system, and character build. This also directly affects confidence in the skill system as a whole. If two specific skills are broken in such a fundamental way, doubts arise about what else might be working wrong without you knowing. In a game where every build decision impacts your survival, you need to be sure that what is written is what will happen. Bugs like this create a distrust that goes beyond the skill itself. With the fix in 1.04, famine and drought now reduce food and hydration values the way they were designed to. This means that whoever chooses these skills will finally have the real challenge they were looking for, without unwanted surprises in the middle of a session. It's a fix that gives agency back to the player, because now the extra difficulty is your choice, not a consequence of something broken that you couldn't control. The improvised fridge is one of those items you build with high expectations because it represents a real leap in your long-term survival capability. Being able to preserve food for longer, organize your groceries efficiently, and have a dedicated structure just for that inside your base, all of this seems simple, but it makes a huge difference in the game's day-to-day. The problem is that before update 1.04, item stacking inside it simply didn't work right, which turned this equipment into something much less useful than it should have been. Without stacking working correctly, the improvised fridge became a container with frustratingly wasted space. You couldn't organize your food compactly, which in practice limited the actual amount of food that fit in it and forced you to use other containers as alternatives, completely defeating the item's main purpose. It's the type of bug that makes you set an entire system aside because using it is more work than simply ignoring it. This mainly affects those playing on servers with other players who need to manage food for more than one person, because then every wasted slot really counts. In a shared base, the improvised fridge should be one of the pillars of the group's supply, an organized, efficient, and reliable place. With broken stacking, it became more of a point of collective frustration than a real solution for resource management. With the fix in 1.04, stacking finally works as expected, and the improvised fridge returns to being what it always should have been: an efficient and reliable container to preserve your food. It sounds like a small fix written like this, but for those who depend on this system daily within the game, it's a change that concretely improves quality of life at the base. Anyone who has a large base in HumanitZ knows that keeping everything in good condition is almost a full-time job. You need to check wall by wall, door by door, and before update 1.04, the game visually warned you about structure damage when they were already at 75% health. This seems reasonable on paper, but in practice, it created a real problem. You ended up repairing things that still had 3/4 of their health intact, wasting resources and maintenance time much earlier than necessary. With the change in 1.04, this damage overlay now only appears when the structure reaches 50% health. This might seem like a small difference in numbers, but it completely changes the dynamics of base maintenance. Now you have a more honest indicator of the real state of your structures, a signal that truly says something needs attention rather than a premature alert that makes you waste repair materials on a wall that was still in good shape. They also adjusted the viewing range of this overlay, which is a detail that matters a lot in larger bases. It does no good for the indicator to appear at the right time if you need to be glued to the wall to see it. With a better viewing range, you can read the state of your base more quickly and efficiently, especially during pressure situations like a horde attack or a PvP raid, where every second counts. In the end, this change is about giving useful information at the right time, which is something interface systems should always prioritize. A good damage indicator doesn't alarm you too early or too late. It arrives when the information actually changes your decision. With 50% as the new trigger, HumanitZ hit a smarter balance, and the player can manage their base with more confidence and less waste of resources in the process. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign.